Well, hello and greetings, everyone. Welcome to the part 2 of our online broadcasting. And we will basically pick up from where we've left it. We're not going to waste too much time for going over the summary. And I trust you've done your homework. I trust you sat with some of the things that we have discussed in part 2, in part 1. So it seems like we have quite an exciting topic today to unravel. And I just trust and hope we'll have enough time to cover both aspects. Let's see how it goes. Maybe some of it would have to be left for part 3, which will be the following Saturday. So, welcome again. And just to say that we will first give ourselves fully to the discourse, then I will guide a meditation, and after that we will take some questions from live audience. Okay. So just to say again, Tantra today, obviously meant to be relevant to our day and time, is the whole purpose, the whole aim of this sharing, of this broadcast, is to reorient ourselves, reposition ourselves, and see how these ancient teachings could be applicable to our day and time. So this Tantra was given various different perspectives, what the term really stands for. But there is one additional perspective that is accepted by all schools of Tantra, and Tantra is weaving various aspects together into something. So Tantra also is that warp on a loom used in textile, in the making of the fabric. So where the warp on a loom catches the thread so as to create that weaving, create that, if you will, fabric. So that term tra is also found in mantra, in yantra, you see? So it's likewise here in Tantra. Tra is that what brings liberation. In all this, it's a certain technique, certain something which can assist us in our own freedom or in regaining our freedom. So that is a system which perhaps rose somewhere from the depth of India some times ago. We don't know exactly when. All this is left to scholarly speculations. But what is of interest to us is that it is in Kashmir Shaivism that Tantra was tamed down, if you will, even domesticated. Tantra became the path of the householder. Or this lofty philosophy became known as an ideal philosophy applicable to the life of the householder. So this is where our primarily interest, if you will, lays. And with that, we could say is that the revival of these teachings, revival of these traditions today, is precisely because we stand on a threshold of breaking free from centuries of religious indoctrinations, where custodians of major Abrahamic religions have, one way or the other, failed to deliver. And although there are pockets, of course, in every great religions, there are pockets, there are internal parts, internal aspects where the essence of the teaching perhaps survived, but it is not available to the majority of people. Therefore, this kind of, if you will, wave of spiritual traditions spilling over from the Orient in the last 150 years, roughly, more or less, have been known as that East meets West. And in cross-pollination exchanges of ideas, some really bizarre things happened in the last decade or so, not the decade, in the last 100 years or so, where it gives us this, if you will, positions us in a place where definitely we are eager to find something which is relevant, applicable, profound, and true. So one of the, if you will, important aspects of Tantric Shaivism, of this monistic non-dual Shaivism, is that it recognizes everything to be, everything, absolutely everything, animate and inanimate objects, animate and inanimate life, is considered to be nothing other than Shiva. Shiva here stands for awareness, one without a second. So this monistic perspective, if you will, speaking in a simple, plain language, is what unifies us all, unifies all the differences. And anything that falls short of this understanding is rooted one way or the other in ignorance. So therefore, our job is here to uproot that ignorance, to uproot anything that denies us the very right to be free and the very right to live life in accord with harmony, which is inherent in the very tenets of these teachings. So, in continuing with our discourse, and I should remind all of us that it is introductory in essence, in nature, so by no means this is the final word to these profound philosophies, but it's just to give us that sweeping, if you will, perspective, sweeping orientation, so that we can then begin to grasp this with greater understanding of how each part sits with the whole. So in the part one, we talked about the three pillars of Tantric philosophy, or the Tantric Shaivism. The teacher-student relationship, which essentially is nothing other than Guru Shishya Parampara, as it is known in Sanskrit. The necessity for awakening of Kundalini, and the very goal, which is seen in Kashmir Shaivism as the realization of this self, realization of one's innermost reality. So these three indispensable pillars that we will give a greater coverage, starting with Guru Shishya Parampara, as it is known in Sanskrit. So when we speak of this, of course, this will give us, again, a kind of insight into the importance of why teacher-student relationship is given such tremendous emphasis in this tradition. And to do so, we will introduce few specifics pertinent to this philosophy, as well as to speak into the general, if you will, situation. So the general situation here is that we have this, when we speak of the teacher-student relationship, we have this, what essentially all this boils down to. It's the transference of knowledge. All this is one way or the other, is for the sake of transference of this knowledge, which is universal in essence. So we can identify, and before I continue, I want to make sure that this is not something that is based on, if you will, literally inferences. This is the synthesis that I freely infuse here with what is well known, as well as what are chiefly my own, if you will, considerations. And I offer them freely for your own considerations to see what is of value, what you can keep and what you can discard. It's all up to you, because this is a very different kind of conversation here. This is offered in the spirit of sharing, and it has that, if you will, incentive behind it, so as to give it a synthesized perspective. So when we speak of this parampara, when we speak of this relationship, that transmission of knowledge, it seems to me that there are three different veins, or the three different perspectives that we can detect here. First one is what could be called as transmission-based. It's a traditional perspective. Transmission-based, where if we look into the written accounts, if we look into the tradition itself, we can find this, if you will, painstaking analysis of how the knowledge was transmitted from preceptor, spiritual preceptor, to a qualified student, so that that student becomes preceptor in his own right. And so it can be traced all the way back, as tradition itself speaks here, to Shiva himself. In other words, all Shaiva lineages, if we are to speak on this transmission-based traditional perspective, traces its origin all the way to Shiva. In this case, in the case of the Trika Shaivism, it traces back to the Shiva in his aspect as that Shiva who resides on the Mount Kailash, right? You may have heard that term. Sri Kantha Natha, that name, Sri Kantha Natha, that Shiva has that name here. Therefore, all the followers of that lineage, that tradition, and this also gave way to these wandering yogis. They wear this, if you know that term, Kantha. Kantha is also this Rudraksha mala of a very large beads strung together on a red thread, Kantha. And you can see, you've seen this, right? Pictures, very colorful pictures of yogis, often smeared in ash. They wear these malas. So this is Kantha. Sri Kantha Natha is the name of Shiva. And the Trika system of Kashmir Shaivism goes all the way, or claims to go all the way, to Shiva in this incarnation, who revived this tradition. And there is another peculiar fact, that the actual Trika system itself was transmitted through a female guru. I'm not going to go down into the names. There are many. One can really lose oneself in this number of names and how it's all aligned together. But it boils down to the youngest of all the siblings. The rest of the tradition was all transmitted to sons, and the last of them all was transmitted by the father to a daughter. And so the female who received this is considered to be the revival originator of the Trika Shaivism as we know it today. All the way when that lineage confluenced again in the great sage Abhinavagupta, and we know that this lineage has gotten kind of into the quicksand somewhere in the medieval India and resurfaced again around the time of roughly 18th, 19th century, culminating in great illustrious late Swami Lakshmanju, who was considered by many scholars and enthusiasts of Tantra, of this particular Tantra, to be the last living exponent of Kashmir Shaivism, who had the lineage going all the way back to Abhinavagupta himself. Now, so this is just one perspective. This is perspective transmission-based, traditional perspective, extremely valid. And of course, there are a lot of debates among the scholars how true this is. And therefore, there is this second perspective. It's a scholarly perspective. Scholarly perspective, of course, values above all else documented grounds. So it's all based on what's available in terms of the documented material, what's available out there, so that one can base one's assumptions on something tangible. So this scholarly perspective, it's exactly works of so-and-so, how this work in relation to the work of another exponent of this tradition, and so it goes. And I thought to add to that the third category, or the third, if you will, perspective. I call it loosely non-linear perspective, or revelation-based, or Shakti-based. In other words, this is a perspective which does not adhere necessarily to that delegation of the lineage, of the tradition, where the act of delegation took place, perhaps witnessed, written down, or at least passed on orally. But it's simply on the account of the pure wisdom, knowledge has been revealed one way or the other. Therefore, it is non-linear, because it could be revealed in a dream, it could be revealed in a profound states of meditation. And there were examples when beings in the past have received this secret, or if you will, dim wisdom, knowledge in a precisely that manner. And it doesn't have these accolades, the so-called spiritual PhDs or doctorates where one can add to one's name. It is simply on the account of its being self-evident in terms of the depth of revelation, and therefore we include it as a non-linear one. And again, the aforementioned Abhinavagupta was perhaps one of the most illustrative examples in whom several traditions confluenced, because during his lifetime, he seemed to soaked in everything what was the best at the time. He had his own master, of course, but he also studied with other masters of his time. And in him, there was this merging of several traditions. So therefore, we speak about this as a great possibility and a legitimate, if you will, way of how tradition is sustained. So from here, we'll give ourselves to a very sensitive or more sensitive aspect of the topic. And this is exemplified in different modalities of what teacher-student relationship exemplifies. Because it has to be applicable to our day and time. And of course, with that, it poses certain dilemmas. Before going into this fully, I want to say that it's no longer a surprise that we live in time, this very precise moment in time, that the whole notion of spiritual preceptor, spiritual authority, and guru undergoes this a tremendous, if you will, reevaluation. There are a lot of critical perspectives that have been voiced in the last 10 to 8 years. We also know that the last couple of years have been filled with a lot of social media backlashes and scandals, where certain very important lineage holders of this or that tradition, and particularly what comes to mind is what happened in Buddhist communities, that the whole notion of the guru is under tremendous scrutiny. Not that there is a novelty in that. This happened earlier on. This happened a decade ago, and 2 decades ago, there were this scandal upon scandal and public scrutiny again and again in terms of what's going on behind the scenes in Tantra in particular. Because very often when we speak of Tantric tradition, whether it's Tantric Buddhism or any of the forms of Tantra known today, periodically there are this information that reaches the surface level of public scrutiny, where essentially Tantra also got this very, very ambiguous reputation because some of its notorious figures were involved in a variety of liaisons, from sexual to the overuse and abuse of power. And I'm not speaking here in terms of trying to qualify this in terms of what's wrong or what's right, but rather in terms of the climate it creates. It's rather where we find ourselves in terms of this, what this relationship represents. Therefore, the Guru Shishya Parampara, the teacher-student relationship, is now in a more difficult time because that phase of innocence where things were based on trust or taken on trust maybe no longer and can no longer be taken for granted either. So we're dealing here with a lot of cultural differences, as some of the publications would have it. Some of the perspectives that have been shared and spoken about and polemized in very important publications in the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, just to my knowledge, they address this and redress this, often from that angle of different in cultural ambivalence in terms of what is allowed, that territory. What is the territory of the allowance in terms of these dynamics? And of course, we are dealing here with intricacies and nuances in a current age of rapidly globalized culture, which it's not a secret, culture which currently serves the needs of individual above all else. It's tailored for the needs of the individual. Therefore, spiritual enterprise is not an exception. Spiritual enterprise here enters the marketplace where spiritual wisdom and knowledge is also on the shelves for the choosing of the eager consumer. So therefore, it places, if you will, this traditional dynamics, traditional relationship under tremendous strain. On one hand, there is already this hefty, or if you will, if you prefer, healthy degree of distrust. And the extreme example of that is where people simply say that we have passed the age where we need a living being who exemplifies this universal principle. In other words, we've done with the gurus. I've heard that not just spoken casually. I've heard that spoken from large platforms, from conference platforms, where the guru is a thing of the past or something which essentially no longer required, no longer needed. It's the kind of unwanted part of the Orientalism that somehow in the West here we can do without. And yet, and this is the strain part, if you will, this is where that nuanced part comes in. When it comes to the understanding of how knowledge is transmitted and how knowledge essentially here is worked with, we will talk about it in a very moment from the perspective of how Trika philosophy speaks about it. There are intricacies which, if completely abandons this dynamics of teacher-student relationship, then the whole thing, if you will, falls apart. And of course, this is for everyone to find out for themselves. Suffice to add, though, is that the essence of this relationship cannot be truly understood by any means of rational understanding. It's not, it almost defies the very existing principles upon which the logic rests, because something else behind the very forces that makes this connection steadfast. And these forces are rooted in the quality of one's perception when we speak of the qualities of the heart. Therefore, teacher-student relationship has always existed and will continue its existence, independent of the climate, independent of all the backlash, independent of the guru hunting, which we live now in time, when the so-called guru hunting is a kind of enterprise where some people make careers out of that. It makes no difference whatsoever when it comes to the spheres of the heart, because this is where the real transformative changes come in. And this is also where the greatest revelations take place. So in other words, it's like every other relationship, motherhood, fatherhood, sisterhood, brotherhood, relationship that is called, that lovers have, friendship, comradeship, anything that unites someone in terms of this alignment. This what teacher-student relationship represents. And it encompasses in itself, dare I say, all aspects of all this aforementioned relationship. Therefore, in India, for example, there's this richness of understanding when it comes to the relationship one can have with one's preceptor. It can take any form depending on what is the preferred modality of so-and-so. And this in itself is dictated, if you will, or predispositioned by a certain attitude we have to our own divine essence. Contemplate on that. I offer you all to ponder on that, what just been said. This relationship already exists. And this is not an abstract relationship with dolphins and trees and cosmos. New Age is very proud in terms of dismissing and installing very different kind of safe modalities where essentially one can never probe into the depth of the psychological and investigation unless one is at some point adheres into this relationship with a living, breathing human being. So this is what I wanted to speak to, so as to make this out into the open for the consideration of all those of you who are interested or would like to walk the path of Tantra, or indeed have been walking this path for many, many years. So now, to understand the underlying dynamics of this teacher-student relationship, I would like to speak about something which is not perhaps exclusive only to the Trika philosophy, but certainly finds its greatest expression in terms of how elaborate this is in this particular philosophical system, in this particular tradition. And we speak here about the fourfold means, the fourfold means, known in Sanskrit as Upayas. Upayas in Sanskrit represent the four conceivable legitimate means employed for the realization of one's essential nature. There are four, but really three that one work with, and you will understand why that is in a moment. We will speak about it in the ascending order. The very first one is known as Anavopaya, from that Sanskrit term anu, which stands for the small unit, atom, and represents individual. So therefore, Anavupaya stands for that individually tailored means, which essentially speaks and views everything from the perspective of the individual, tailored for the evolution of the individual. And it utilizes the power of action. There's a Sanskrit term which stands for that action, is kriya. I don't remember if in the part one we talked about this triad, that trinity of Iksha, Jnana, Kriya. Iksha stands for will, Jnana, knowledge, and Kriya, action. Whenever there is something, there is this triad behind. Whenever there is something, there's always will. Whenever there is will, there is know how to. And whenever there is a knowing how to, there is action. Action is a result of something which is being willed into existence and accompanied or assisted by the knowledge of how. Therefore, it is known as will, knowledge, and action. So in this case, in the case of Anavapaya, the individually tailored means, the action or the power of action is that driving force, because it's an expression of what is known as Kriya Shakti. So this is the first mean. The second mean is known as Shaktopaya. Shaktopaya, as the term Shakta, Shakti, Shakto, Shakti, which stands for power. It's empowering means. The means where essentially the working force here is exemplified in the ability to extract that transformative energy through correct influence, through correct understanding. So it's intellectual means, but not spoken in terms of mind, as often erroneously explained. It is still remains to be the dynamic means where the Shakti is the driving force, or Jnana Shakti, because this is the power of knowledge. If in the individual means, the power of action is the driving force. In Shaktopaya is the power of knowledge, Jnana, because it is an expression of Jnana Shakti or Jnana Shakti. Now the third means, or the third upaya, still in ascending order, is known as Shambhavupaya. Shambhu is just another name for Shiva in his playful, jolly attitude. Shambhu, Shiva, or Shiva Shambhu. Sometimes there's like this chant, you have heard them, right? Shiva, Shiva, Shiva Shambhu. Shambhu is the playful, jolly, juvenile aspect of Shiva. And Shambhavupaya is the mean of consciousness. It's the mean, or the upaya, where consciousness is the means. With the driving agent or the driving force is the power of will, spoken of here as Iksha. Why? Because the operating power is Iksha Shakti, that Shakti of one's own will. This is considered to be the highest mean. The highest because it's still mean, still applicable. Beyond that one, there is the fourth. The fourth, simply known as Anupaya. Anupaya means no means mean. It's the means where no means employed. And the power here, operating power, is that of one's bliss, because it is the expression of Ananda Shakti. And Ananda Shakti is the most powerful of them all. It's the most subtle. And when Ananda Shakti is employed, we speak of no means. Everything is achieved automatically on its own accord. Maybe, just to say, it requires a preceptor to make a vague reminder, a vague hint, just a tap on the shoulder, as I often say, just like metaphorically. And the realization follows from there and blossoms. Why? Because no means are employed. So these four upayas, if you will, are very well known in Trika system, and the three ones are employed and worked with on a regular basis. It's very important that we do not create the separation in terms of how these means are employed, so that there's no somehow that, oh, this student is only given the Shambhavupaya means to work with, and another one sits on the Anavupaya, individually tailored means. This means employed interchangeably, depending on readiness of the aspirant or even entire group sometimes. So in other words, one can sometimes apply the highest mean just to test the climate, to test the waters, to see how it sits. If it takes in a group of, let's say, in a Sangha, only one person or two people will take this because there is this readiness, then the teaching will begin to lean on the other upayas in a descending order, going all the way to what Anavupaya often spoken as inferior means. I don't want to give that coloring to that, because then somehow with this inferior means one may end up having this understanding that they're somehow inferior. Let it be very clearly understood that it doesn't matter what means are employed as long as it leads to the desired goal. The goal is Shiva, one's own selfhood. Therefore, whatever means employed, whatever means are applicable here and applicable in terms of the status of so-and-so, the status of the aspirant, that's what really makes the difference, and that's what really matters. So now when we spoke about that, you can see that working with this means is inseparable from the health of the psychological climate that teacher-student relationship can really, really serve for the sake of evolution. You might have, or some of you may have heard, that the teacher-student relationship, although it takes two to tango, is known as a one-way affair. And that's what a lot of people in the West do not like, or do not like to, if you will, accept, because, well, with demos as the highest exegesis, with democracy as the highest idea that we've carried from the ancient Greece into our day, there is this somehow understanding that if this spiritual authority there to usurp our individual freedom, that with that, the very principles of democracy are undermined. I will leave this to some other discussion or for your own inquiry, because this is not as simple or not as straightforward as it seems. And there are some very good works on the topic. There are some good literature which separates wheat from the chaff in terms of what the current cultural ideals serving, in fact, and how the role of a spiritual authority fits into this, which seems to come to disrupt that very neatly sitting set of affairs. And therefore, it's unwanted element that no real spiritual seeker wants. We want to have the results, but somehow without the ordeal of going into this, what, let's say, understood without almost words in traditions such as Sufism, Tantra, and various schools of Buddhism, in many other traditions that thrived and still exist in Japan and Orient in general. So what I invite you to also bring the parallels between various other different disciplines, so that the spiritual discipline doesn't sit separately. And I often give these examples that in order to learn craft, if we want to learn the craft only at a superficial level of handling of the material, then we deny ourselves the possibility of learning the subtler dimension of what is there to learn. And it is that subtler dimension that requires a certain degree of subjugation of our will to the will of the perceptor, which essentially creates that, if you will, dissonance when it comes to the cultural status of what spiritual perceptor stands for. And I know a lot of teachers today who suffer this, if you will, consequences of a very, very incoherent, inconsistent, often slanderous accusations without real proper basis behind them. But this is only on the account and due to the fact that it's culturally supported sentiment. Therefore, if spiritual perceptor trips, then he ought to be destroyed, let alone depedestalized. So this is, again, fertile ground for your own investigations and pondering. And yet, with that, the underlying side of this is also that it will not be correct to say that only Orientals somehow, people who born beyond the Bosphorus, can summon up in themselves this possibility of where this relationship can be fruitful, because we know a lot of examples where Westerners by birth, who were born as far as California, displayed devotion and service to the spiritual perceptors, which is nothing short of a legendary, if not epical. But that again is just spoken out loud. Other than that, the prevalent notion is it's safer to be just a teacher, just a lecturer, or perhaps your friend, and then no more. Why? Because this New Age notion of guru is within and everything is one's own guru are the slogans that took hold, perhaps even the brightest minds of our time, and serve, essentially remaining in a status quo under the hard core of that egoic structure, not to give in for any possibility, let alone threat, to overthrow this, what is there to go anyway, because that's the whole process. The process of self-realization is inseparable from the realization of the non-self. If any of you have ever read anything by the great sage of the 20th century, Ramana Maharshi is known for, you have probably encountered that Ramana Maharshi said the self doesn't need to be realized. The self is already all there is. What is need to be realized here is simply the non-self, or rather the fact that non-self does not exist. So the whole ordeal is summarized to that. And no other spiritual tradition where monism is its ground would disagree with that. So, in short, Tantric Shaivism, because we speak about this particular school, this particular philosophy in Tantra today, emphasizes the need for teacher-student relationship because it's considered to be indispensable for the aforementioned reasons. Reasons that are less obvious than meets the eye and less obvious than just what is spoken in very pedestrian manner, even if it's spoken at highly publicized events. I'm sorry, it does not mean that those who speak about it know an iota of what this relationship is really based on. Again, This is for your own consideration. So, yes, great Indian teacher of our time, right? Very famous one, at least Sadhguru. In one of his videos, he said, "Yes, everything can be your guru, the tree and this and that and the elephant, but it's simply easier and better when it's happened to be a human being, because in a human being you can see yourself. In a tree, it will take you maybe that many years as it took for the tree to grow, and if it happened to be a 500-year-old oak tree, then you are in for some dilemma here." So now with this, and of course this is just a brief introduction to a very complex topic, to a very complex subject that the dynamics of teacher-student relationship represents. And we shall return to this on any occasion when it is needed. So I welcome you now. I'm just going to check what is happening there with the questions. We will go back to the questions after a short meditation. And I've mentioned that I will introduce also the second pillar of this mighty philosophical system, and that is Kundalini, or the importance of Kundalini. So perhaps this will serve only as an introduction, perhaps in depth, and we will pick it up in part 3, simply because it will not be possible to give all our due to speak to this topic. And before I even begin, I would remind ourselves that we are working on the very first online course that we will complete, hopefully in the next coming month, specifically and utterly dedicated to the knowledge of Kundalini, to the science of Kundalini, because I think it's timely. But we can speak a little bit about it now. So, when we say Kundalini, we immediately, as soon as we say that, run into the danger of being misunderstood. And the reasons for that are rooted essentially in the way that term began to circulate and has been in use for quite some times. One of the main predicaments that comes with this misunderstanding is the fact that Kundalini is spoken of in terms of certain yogic processes designed, tailored for what is known in a tradition as a deliberate, even at times forceful, awakening of that latent power. Whilst at the same time, if we are to give Kundalini a more all-encompassing view, then we will have to speak of Kundalini in terms of the self, all there is, Godhead, Mother Divine, the ultimate power, Shakti herself, Atman. In other words, anything pertinent to our soul. And from the monistic perspective, whenever we say our soul, we know that the soul is absolute, right? That Vedantic and Tantric perspective here, exemplified in that Jiva is Shiva, or Atman is Brahman. That Vedantic Atman is Brahman, or Tantric Jiva is Shiva. Jiva stands for individual soul. Atman stands for the individual soul. Individual soul is nothing other than absolute in disguise. So Kundalini is that. It's nothing short of that. And we've mentioned Ramana Maharshi earlier, and I would like to bring the sage and his words here again, simply because the biases about Kundalini largely reinforced by what comes as a total surprise by those who claim to belong to the lineages of the great sage. Whereas whenever Ramana Maharshi was asked to comment or to speak about Kundalini and what it represents, on several occasions he reinstated that Kundalini is nothing other than the self. Kundalini is Shakti herself. Kundalini is Atman, and Kundalini is all there is in terms of what it exemplifies. Furthermore, you can Google, often I say, just put these two names together and you will get plenty of confirmation. Ramana Maharshi on Kundalini, and you will get papers, exact conversations that took place between so and so when they were addressing the great sage. All this was documented, written down. To lay these speculations asunder, Ramana Maharshi made it very clear that the path of the yogi and the path of the jnani, which Ramana Maharshi has exalted, are all culminates in the rising of Kundalini in the Sushumna. In other words, whether one is given to the path or practice of self-inquiry, or one is given to the yogic tradition of working with pranas, and now if we are to speak of Hatha Yoga, not that the Tantra today is the same, we will speak of the distinctions and differences, but if we are to speak of such radically different perspectives that the question was asked of Ramana Maharshi, how self-inquiry differs to the path of the yogis in India at the time when it was spoken in relation to the Hatha yogis in particular. He simply said that the yogi will activate the life force by working with breath. And the one who walks the path of jnana will do that by repeated process of self-inquiry. When the mind subsides, Kundalini will rise on her own. But in both cases, it rises, ascends through Sushumna channel, period. Speculation is over. It requires only an investigation into this to lay these things once and for all outside of the argument, which essentially detracts the real work of as many a spiritual aspirant out there, because they're given the perspective that somehow there is other outside of Kundalini path, that Kundalini is somehow an alternative perspective, that somehow rising of Kundalini is somehow just a crazy path of the yogis, but a clean-cut guys and girls who wants to do it in an office chair by attending the workshops of the non-dual teachers don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to get messy. They can do it neat and tidy. This is the biggest dilemma in spiritual circle today. It turns spiritual circle into a circus. Why? Because people go around the circle with this and never get qualitative answers and understanding whilst wasting precious time. So therefore, we speak about it with short, sweeping perspective to put things as they are in the right perspective. There is no awakening other than an outside of the awakening of what Kundalini here represents. Anything else we speak of as awakening is a metaphor. It's a language. It's at best a flowery used words to maybe drive something or make some impact by what we're saying. But as far as awakening real, awakening proper, there's nothing other than Kundalini that awakens. Because there is nothing other than Kundalini in its dormant state of homeostasis is what gives us this illusory sense of slumber towards our essential reality. Because Kundalini is nothing other than the power behind individuation. Kundalini itself, as Shakti, as the force of Shiva, as the power of Shiva, is that self-imposed slumber which causes the perception of difference and gives rise to this separate entity, separate identity. And it is only through the awakening of Kundalini that this predicament can be essentially brought to its resolution. Without Kundalini awakening, this is impossible. Why? Because Kundalini conducts absolutely every affair in the house. Why different methodologies are used to awaken life force? That's a totally different story. In the case of the aforementioned Ramana Maharshi, he had his preference on the Atma Vikara. And that, why he chose that, we don't know. We can only speculate why. Maybe because that's how he came to that realization and how that awakening took place. But one way or the other, all schools of yoga, all philosophical systems, wherever we go, squarely agree that that dormant force, and it also was known by various different names in antiquity before the term Kundalini itself came into the use, has always been known as the very tour de force of spiritual transformation. So therefore the time has come to make it very clear for everyone who is serious about their spiritual evolution, about the spiritual transformation, that they know what they're dealing with and what they're working with. And again, this is spoken in the crowd, in the gatherings of those who are fit to hear this. Obviously, for those who are simply curious about these spiritual matters, curious, like just, want to quench their curiosity. All this is irrelevant because up until there is desire to know oneself, which in itself is the domain of Kundalini. Non-self doesn't know itself. It's only that what is self-generated, just as it's self-imposed slumber, in the same way, it is self-revelation. Therefore, in English language, it's always spoken in terms of realization, recognition. You see? That RE here is of value because it's something that happens to that what is already all there is. So it happens on the account of realizing, remembering, recognizing. And the force behind this is always the force of Shakti. And Kundalini is a prana Shakti in the body. So it is the force responsible for individuation. Likewise, it's the force responsible for unraveling this individuation across the universe. And that's why in Trika system, it's the second pillar or the pillar, one of the three pillars, indispensable aspects, without which there's no spiritual work at all. Everything else is a wishful thinking unless there is this visceral and factual awakening and rising of the Kundalini. So, and again, I will not go more into the biases, why that is, like why these teachers accept and these teachers deny. Because I don't want to end up being misunderstood and somebody takes the wrong end of the stick. But yes, there is also understanding which has always been present in spiritual tradition of India. And jnana was spoken in two different ways. To understand it better, for those of you who are more familiar with Western language, that term gnosis, which essentially is ancient Greek term for knowing. Gnosis comes from Sanskrit gyan. Gnosis comes from gyan, knowledge. But it's not the knowledge of something. It's not knowledge about something. Gnosis, just as gyan, is in terms of knowing that by virtue of which everything else is known. So it's not knowing about something. It's knowing it directly. And to assist that, in Sanskrit, there was always an accompanying term to supplement jnana. There is jnana and there's vijnana. Jnana and vijnana. Jnana is the knowledge, and vijnana, it's direct apprehension, which what the term gnosis represents in terms of its sacred potential in Western Hemisphere, as far as the term gnosis, what it is pregnant with. So this vijnana, just as there is this very important Kashmir Shaiva scripture, Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which is known as the garland of various forms of meditation. Over 100 different forms of meditation, different techniques described in Vijnana Bhairava Tantra of how to know oneself directly. So this is why the biases, especially when it comes to the spiritual communities dominated by this movement known as satsang movement, dominated by non-duality scene, dominated by neo-Advaita, was dismissing Kundalini because it's misunderstood and simply because it was not experienced by majority of teachers. Having little awakening here, little agitation there, maybe caused even more confusion for some instead of clarity. Whereas there are, I would say, I don't want to start speaking in terms of percentages, but there are many teachers out there who are teaching simply from what they understood. They understood it. Good for them. Fantastic job. They're doing great, but that does not mean that they're even awakened, technically speaking. So in other words, it's not even the teaching that proceeds through the finer levels of how the speech itself comes into the audible level, because they speak from the level of only that gross level of speech where ideas and words are formed at that level of Vaikari. Whereas the teaching can only proceed from the subtler, deeper dimension of reality when one is awakened to that dimension of reality fully. And that utmost dimension of reality is known as para-vak in Sanskrit. Para, ultimate, beyond. Para, that para, it's the ultimate source of speech. And the spiritual speech has to come from the level of para-vak. Vak is relevant and equivalent to the term logos, that biblical, in the beginning there was a word, and the word was God, and it was with God. You see, in the same way, the tradition of the Orient speaks with that same clarity in terms of the origin of everything. And the very ancient term for Kundalini was simply that, Vak, the Shakti of pure originating sound. And it is the Shakti that conceals reality and Shakti that reveals reality. This is the understanding that Tantra works with. So Kundalini here is not an alternative, something that happens to me or happens to that yogi, and I want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. I will do it some other way. I'll read different books. I'll go to different teachers. Up until that understanding prevails, misunderstanding prevails. Therefore, the time has come, we bring clarity into the spiritual circles, that without the awakening of Kundalini, there is no spiritual gnosis. It's as simple as that. So, well, we've got now maybe time to take a little pause. This will serve as that in-depth introduction, and we will pick up from here and we'll continue to speak about Kundalini and maybe touching just a little bit what is within the context of these three parts about its processes, culminating in how self-realization is understood and what self-realization stands for in and from the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism. Okay? So therefore I welcome you all to now have a short seating, just to give ourselves to a little guided meditation before we turn our attention to questions. So please make yourself seated comfortably, upright, not completely slouching down. You can have your back supported or freely sitting if that's more preferable, wherever you are. And put your devices aside so that they're not in direct contact with the body. And I'll give us short guided meditation, just like in the previous part, based on this intimate functioning of the body, exemplified in the movement of our own breath. So there's nothing really uncommon or unusual. We will be simply working with perhaps a greater degree of attention. We simply will work with attention and direct our awareness to specifics and subtle aspects of this process. Okay? So let's close our eyes. And I welcome you to simply sit as you are for a moment, without any agendas, without any goings or comings. Don't even worry about meditating. Simply give yourself this moment of complete and utter repose. You can undo your buttons, whatever restrains your breath, your diaphragm, as we'll be working with it. And in that complete relaxed state, just make a short screen of the body and feel if there is any tension, any discomfort, and simply relax into that rather than trying to ignore it. Simply acknowledge where you are right now in your body, physically, emotionally, mentally. If you detect tension in any parts of your body, I welcome you to inhale deeply, almost as if you're inhaling into that area itself, be it the back of a neck, shoulders, lower back, legs, neck, any area. And exhale, simply relaxing that area, at least sending that impulse for relaxation. Remember, we don't do anything to meditate, we simply create the possibility for meditation to flow spontaneously because that's our natural state. And it's just giving circumstances a chance for it to be an actualized experience. Inhale, bring your attention to your diaphragm, and for few breaths, simply observe how the walls of the tummy move in and out in response to each and every inhalation and exhalation. Or rather, as a part of each incoming and outgoing breaths. Become fully aware of the movement of your own diaphragm. And allow a greater relaxation to send its way from there throughout the entire body. Do not try to alter anything about the breathing itself. Let the breath proceed in its naturalness without trying to slow it down, holding it at any point, or speeding it up. Just follow the movement of breath with utter innocence of the observer. As you begin to feel more internalized, bring your awareness higher to the organs of respiration and observe the incoming and outgoing breath from the moment the air enters the nostrils paying attention to the duration of the incoming breath, short repose where the breath subsides before it turns direction. The duration of the outgoing breath and a short repose on the outside. And simply become aware of these 2 points of a repose on the inside, on the outside. Where the breath moves freely in between. Just acknowledge that moment of repose, that short moment where the breath seems to be suspended. It's neither moving in nor out. Do not try to prolong or hold it, simply allow this to be natural as it gets. Suffice you become aware of these very subtle points of suspension where breath is no longer. And if breath is no longer, the mind is no longer. With refinement of the breath, there is a refinement of the mental activity. Yet if the thoughts come, do not try to oppose them. Any sensations, feelings, pleasant or unpleasant, no matter. Do not try to oppose any of it. Simply observe it all with the same eye of indifference. Release any effort whatsoever. Relax completely and utterly into this, what is taking place now as the breathing. Let your awareness be completely infused in observing minute subtlety of your own breath. And take a deep breath whilst keeping your eyes still closed. And gently prepare to externalize your awareness. Keep your eyes closed for another few moments just to make this transition smoother. Otherwise, slowly, sweetly begin to come out into the extroverted mode of awareness. So I will give the remaining time to some of the live questions that some of you have posted into the live chat. I'll just take them randomly. Well, perhaps I'll take kind of a more of a controversial, edgy question here in terms of being put on a spot. So it's the question coming from Shawit Asefa. So if one decides to commit to become a real life disciple of yours, and you also accept them as a disciple, then which parampara or lineage will that disciple be plugged into? It's a very good question. It's a question that I often advise some of those who approach me with these matters in terms of discipleship or in terms of doing this work. And I made it very clear on several occasions. In fact, I've made it also, there are public accounts of that. So if one cares to do some research, you will find that I've never claimed to have any traditional way of being appointed by a teacher. So it is an appointment which is taken upon myself, and it falls into the category which I have touched upon as a non-linear way, because this is also could be spoken in terms of the way siddhas are being initiated. So in other words, the initiation of, traditionally even speaking, of adepts takes place in this otherwise physical reality, but there is another initiation takes place at a subtle plane. And of course, we could leave this area is open to profound, or rather the territory is open to speculation. You know, like anyone can come and declare that they are fit to hold the space because they have had these inner revelations, and where and how can that be determined? So I completely am with that. And yet, that being said, we know that this exists within the given tradition and within the given understanding. My own teacher, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, was not appointed by his guru, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati. A very different disciple of Swami Brahmananda Saraswati got appointed as the holder of the Shankaracharya of Jyotirmath. And yet Maharishi took that, if you will, upon himself after spending some times in solitude, and of which he wrote. It's available. Those who have TM background or who have read anything about Maharishi Mahesh Yogi know that he simply declared that he had this inner revelation and the inner command that he received to begin the worldwide regeneration movement. So the desire, if you will, to teach is not coming from a place of, oh, I would want to become a teacher. It is rooted in these very transformative processes where that very principle, if you will, the universal principle, comes into fruition. And that in itself is a spontaneous and natural process. But I would never try to fabricate something and fool someone and say that, this is so and so, and I come from that lineage. Therefore, if you are to, kind of get more acquainted in the way I speak very often, joke or speak in a kind of light-hearted manner, we speak of this as a pirate's way. We raise our flag and we sail the seas. Some people may not like that comparison because pirates have a very, very wet reputation, right? But it's spoken from, if you will, as an analogy is given here. So the parampara here is transmitted at the level where it is not taking place in the presence of disciples or in the presence of the leading teacher who gives that, delegates that, you see? And yet the audacity to come and speak and hold this place is not rooted in nothing. So I'm fully also aware that this puts me in disadvantage in comparison to a lot of teachers who could claim to have this, let's say, credentials that come from, well, I am being trained, and even if I haven't been, let's say, appointed as a holder of the lineage, at least I'm the one who is trained in this or that, you see? So this much I could say. So in other words, it's a non-linear belonging to the tradition of the Siddhas. I wish I had that quote handy somewhere, but it belongs to the Abhinavagupta, where he speaks about the transmission of this knowledge beyond the means that are spoken in terms of this traditional handling of the mantle. And the initiation is taking place nowhere on the physical plane of existence. It is always taking place beyond the domain of this, what is available to the senses. And the siddhahood, real proper siddhahood, is that understanding of the innate perfection where one's identity with the Supreme has been cognized to the degree when one will have full audacity to come and speak about this and lead others into that, which is the birthright. So that's as far as response to which parampara you are plugging in, if you have the courage, conviction, and karma to follow this or that teacher. But in this case, in terms of my own self, this is not in relation to plugging into some existing lineage. So therefore, even when I speak about my own teacher, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, I never speak about him in terms of as this, if you will, continuation of the lineage. Otherwise, I would have had Maharishi's picture behind me right now. Maybe sometimes I have the Maharishi's picture, maybe sometimes I don't. but it doesn't, if you will hear, legitimize what I do. It's my personal, private affair. And those who know me, they know that to be true. And since I can see that there is another question from the same person, and since I touched up on it before even seeing it, okay, so just turn it around. So is it the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati lineage, or another Parampara lineage within the Kashmir Shaivism tradition? Or is this irrelevant? I don't want to confuse anyone here. So I would have to make maybe a kind of a slightly different stand so that there's a greater understanding and also maybe a degree of simplicity before certain maturity and your own understanding comes, when this will become almost answered without being answered. The realization of ultimate reality equalizes absolutely everything. So the tradition and lineage of the Siddhas, all Siddhas, if you will, are known for being bathed in the same waters of light of their own awareness. So the differences in terms of their temperaments, personalities, and how the lila, or that play of consciousness, exhibits itself in a particular body before it will cease to be in terms of this form, is really irrelevant, in as much as that what is spoken about now is true and really, really real, authentic. Therefore, this tradition that, let's say, always will exist at two levels. There will always be the surface level, the container, which is very important, the formal aspect, the dress code, the garment, the entourage, the how it looks, because I don't want to dismiss this either. And underneath of that, there is always the stream of Shakti, which reassures that this knowledge is transmitted and streamed from heart to heart. So in other words, this, and by the way, this is known, and it's not just pertinent to Tantra. You can find allusions of that in Sufism. And this posed a lot of problems for scholars, for scholars who are known as Orientologists and Indologists, not Egyptologists so much, but talking about, let's say, scholars in the West who studied Sufism, how the passing and transmission took place. Because at the face value, there is this a distinctive form. There is this distinctive, if you will, character of this, of so-and-so, in terms of the passing of the lineage, who becomes the holder of the lineage. And at the same time, there is some other aspects, some other very important factors which completely disregard that. And so that tension between the formal aspect, right, and what is the inner core, those of you who, let's say, come from Muslim tradition, right, Islam is known to have Sharia and Tariqah. Sharia is the code of conduct applicable to external code of conduct, and it's a law. That's how it is translated, the law. And yet there is Tariqah, and that's the internal realm, which in terms of that particular tradition comes from deep inner revelations of the Prophet associated with this religion. And the tension between Sharia and Tariqah has always been the very passionate subject of debate and debates of what is more important. We know that Ibn Arabi set the record straight. He said that the Tariqah is the heart of Islam as the eternal submission to the will of the Almighty. And yet the Sharia is that what allows to carries this, if you will, serves as the container. In the same way, we could say that in relation to any other tradition that survived its day to our present time, because it had this container that allowed this possibility for these extraordinary refined teachings to flow and be present, available for our day and age. You see? Yet the realization itself transcends the container, transcends completely. The light of one's own awareness obliterates all the differences of all these traditions. So this is what I said. I want to take this step back to give this perspective so that there is a great understanding when it comes to the relevance and lack of thereof. Okay, well, it's a quick question here. What do you mean by fullest human potential? Can you please give us more insights to access this potential? Well, that's exactly what is spoken in terms of Kundalini. Kundalini is spoken of and known as the fullness of the human potential, because dormant Kundalini, or Kundalini in homeostasis, is the human potential in its potentiality. It's not actualized fully. So in other words, the whole notion of the human being here is a very, very vague idea. We lean on this understanding, we lean on this understanding, we go there to study this, we go there to study that, we try to understand, we get lost in all this, what human being represents here, in all its complexity, you see? And then we end up actually having to settle on some set of understandings which arrests us at that, what we then kind of, if you will, admit as just, me, pure human being, what can I do? I'm just this. And that in itself is considered to be, if you will, a lack of understanding, ignorance, lack of knowledge of one's own self. That's what full human potential here represents. It's not about how far you can jump, how far you can, fly. It's not about potentials in terms of this multidimensionality of this physical existence. It's not about the potential of, painting amazing pictures, or composing amazing music, or being able to be an extraordinary individual in that sense. All this is expressions of Shakti anyway, which then are attributed or assigned to this or that individual. But the core of who we are, up until it remains to be, if you will, hidden, unrevealed, remains to be unactualized. So we live, as it were, in a state of potentiality. This is what I often speak, and this is in lieu with the way the tradition speaks about it. There are interesting questions from the same person about Nirvikalpa and Savikalpa samadhis. When the Savikalpa becomes Nirvikalpa. Savikalpa, for those of you who don't know, means with the presence of some mental awareness, known in Sanskrit as kalpa, some frequency, some vibration, some kalpa. Savikalpa means with the kalpa, with some mental awareness. And Nirvikalpa is without. Samadhi is states of absorption. When it happens is when all these faculties are withdrawn to such degree, just as it happens in your following up question, by the way. So I will amalgamate both these questions. just as it happens in a deep sleep, when in a dream state, waking state activity and senses, function of the senses is withdrawn into the mind in a dream, and then it's then gradually withdrawn into the domain of the deep sleep, into the domain of the causal. So mind, it's idle. It completely switches off. It's turned off. No kalpa is present in a deep sleep. But it's not the same as samadhi, because samadhi is luminous, deep sleep is opaque. Deep sleep corresponds to the tamaguna and the causal, karmic. So it's actually expression of tamaguna. Therefore, it's completely inert, and there is nothing that we can say about it. There's no experience, because there is no mental modifications. And though deep sleep and samadhi have some degree of similarity, in fact, it's an interesting question, because Trika philosophy speaks of samadhi as yet another form, more refined though, of a deep sleep. But as I said earlier, the chief characteristics of samadhi is its luminosity and fullness of awareness. When you come out of the samadhi, you come out of fullness of awareness. When you come out of deep sleep, you simply come out of that complete slumber. You have to kind of few fractions of the seconds maybe to even realize what's going on, where you are, and so forth. And there is this kind of like, remnants of the presence of the tamaguna in it. And that's what also gives you a deep rest as well. Whereas samadhi is luminous, translucent, transparent. It's filled with expansiveness of one's own self. In samadhi is known for, but there are degrees of samadhi which is not the current subject of our gathering, so we don't want to just go there, because we don't want to lose too many people behind who are not familiar with these concepts and with these specifics. So suffice to say that yes, they are close, but the differences have been given. Can you state the difference between prana and kundalini, if any? Okay, so basically, when we speak of kundalini, it's prana shakti. It's what prana shakti is. And again, the reason why we speak of kundalini as being in the body is because it's pertinent to that individualized perspective. And individual perspective is always dealing with the body as a reference point, whereas in fact, Kundalini is inside and outside, because it's consciousness itself. It's Shakti. It's in and out. It's all pervasive. And the gamut of psychosomatic and psychophysiological experiences that Kundalini is accompanied is known because there is this activation of the pranic sheath and pranic body, which can display itself in so many different ways, and that in turn reinforces our understanding that somehow this Kundalini causes this, and that somehow inside the body, you see? But Kundalini is prana. That's what conducts all other subordinate pranas in the body. From all the pranas, prana, apana, vyana, samana, and udana, all the subordinate to the force of Kundalini. But with that being said, we're entering here these nuances, intricacies that can only be understood and spoken in the full gamut of how this process of ascent take place. Because only when Kundalini is fully risen, fully, if you will, ascended, then there is this, what is known as harmonization of pranas can take place. In the earlier phases, Kundalini is dependent on the functioning of these pranas, you see? So in other words, it has to free itself. And various pranas play its role, just like Udana prana, which is responsible for the ascent, because that's the prana of that fountain-like movement. And Vyana prana is that which is all-pervasive prana. This is what gives us the experience of expansiveness, that experience of all-pervasiveness. But all this is Kundalini. So it could be spoken in terms of interchangeably, but prana then can be spoken specifically in relation to pranas only, you see, as different vayus in the body. Whereas when we speak of Kundalini, we speak of it as prana shakti. Prana shakti conducts all affairs in the house. Prana shakti is all there is. This is it's an interesting question because it speaks to that paradox. When there is no personal performer in direct recognition, how comes the spiritual teachers say that one is responsible for everything that is happening in one's life? What exactly is a healthy ego? So this is, if you will, where the very important distinction comes into. So there is no personal performer, which is the very, very basis of yoga of action, right? The karma yoga, the main tenets of karma yoga is that actions are not performed. You know, only the gunas of nature perform this, and one is uninvolved. So that touch dualistic perspective is given here, which will be resolved in later chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, which begins with the exaltation of the yoga of action. And the same we can see here relevance to the upayas we spoke about earlier, how the upayas pertinent to the or designed for the individual means actualize action. Action is driving force, but action here, of course, performed without the attachment to the fruits of what this action can bring or not. And the reasons for that, of course, are rooted in the very understanding and the philosophy of karma yoga itself, that up until we are involved in this attachment, then the law of karma is reinforcing this, what essentially in spiritual terms we're trying to, if you will, loosen up. We're trying to loosen up the dependency of the subject on the object. We're trying to loosen up that complete arrested state where the subject is identifying with actions to such degree that everything is then objectified and the world is rendered asunder. So therefore, the philosophy of karma yoga is a prerequisite, a step in the ascending ladder, if you will, of human evolution. And the reminder that there is no personal performer is given to understand the very principles of this yoga of action, right? So that one can perform action, as you remember, if you remember, for the sake of action. So you are involved in the action fully for the sake of action itself, not for the sake of what this action may bring or may not bring. You need to understand it's subtle, but quite straightforward, simple, but subtle, you see? Straightforward, subtle, and yet simple. So this is an important prerequisite here, so as to free oneself from that gripping from the grip of what karma brings here, because then it doesn't allow the unfoldment of the fuller potential in the individual. So it's a prerequisite. And yet, as your question is built here, that some teachers say that everyone is responsible for one's life. So in other words, there is no even problem with the ego here. So what is healthy ego? It's like healthy ego is that what is the principle of individuation. So if that, or else spoken of as psychological maturity. Psychological maturity is understanding that things, they are as they are. And before one can do anything about trying to change them, amend them, one needs to learn how to accept them. So it's a simple, pure, if you will, folk wisdom upon which a lot of daily life is based. And the responsibility, of course, that is brought by many teachers, and I often speak about it myself, of course, squarely falls on the shoulders of oneself, because if we just give ourselves to this understanding that we are not involved, we're not acting, whilst at the same time secretly still very much live the world of attachment to all the desires and all the yearnings in our life, then we create possibility for spiritual bypassing by giving this formulation of this idea somehow. Well, it is like this because it is like this. You know, if I don't meditate, if I don't do anything for my own good, if I don't try to introduce balance in my life, because, you know, this is how it is, then you accept essentially this inert state of affairs, which are perfectly within your capacity to bring often necessary changes, which reintroduces the greater balance. So one can then turn around and say, well, being able to be responsible for this without being attached is also a possibility. And that doesn't go in contradiction. One can be detached and yet still fully actively pursuing this, what is in the interest of one's happiness, of one's evolution, of one's well-being, you see? Otherwise, we get caught in that mental loop which keeps us prisoners to the status quo, and speaking in terms of the Ayurveda, simply being engrossed in tamaguna and not willing to do anything about it. So, you see, that's why. What happens when breath enters the medium channel? We will speak about that more in part 3, which is part of that, which will, when we continue about the processes that Kundalini, awakened Kundalini, brings about. Okay, we'll just stumbled on this question, maybe just because it's just happened to be there. If spiritually advanced beings can heal various alignments, why they die from different illnesses? Yes, it is true that, well, even if we are to speak about some of the spiritual luminaries of not so distant past, many of them have passed away or left this body or died, whatever you prefer, from what would be, the cause, right? Cancer, this, that, diabetes. We know that many spiritual luminaries, especially, interestingly enough, from India, they suffered from diabetes in its severe forms. Ananda Mayama, Swami Muktananda, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for that matter, and many others have had these severe forms of the diabetes, right? So kind of like runs contradictory. We know that Ramana Maharshi, who has been mentioned in today's gathering, had cancer on his arm, and he refused that arm to be amputated for the cancerogenic growth to keep spreading. He just accepted this as a... So this, of course, causes a lot of disconcern in today's understandings. And again, this is not a straight cut. So we cannot just apply these examples of these great spiritual luminaries as basing our understanding of what are the healing processes. Why that is, I want to remind us that there is this correlation between individualized consciousness, right? Exemplified by what have been spoken about, by the status of Kundalini, and the functioning of the principle responsible for this individuation in relation to the body, known as ahamkara in Sanskrit. That ahamkara, that principle of individuation here, is what safeguards and creates the healthy boundaries of that individual, from physical to somatic to energetic. Yet it's also true that in the case of some great luminaries whose consciousness was exalted beyond, let's say, comparable examples among their contemporaries, have known to suffer assault on their ahamkaras. I don't want to say that this is so, but just as for your own, if you will, information, if you want to read or learn more about this, if you want to continue this conversation some other time, but I just want to say this. In the case of someone like Ramana Maharshi, awakening took place at such a tender early age, where his own ahamkara was still in formation. Ahamkara, I don't know exactly whether this is true or not in terms of the neuroscience, could relate to the culmination of the formation of the thyroid activity, which takes over all functioning in the body approximately at the age of puberty and culminates by the age of what we know as growing into a grown individual, to becoming adult, which approximately 22 to 25 years, which also coincides with the formation of that, what in psychology today spoken as notion of one's own self, that the formation of the healthy ego in terms of the, well, in terms of if we to equip ourselves with the understandings present in psychological studies, right? The psychotherapy and psychology deals with this. If there is healthy development by the age of 25, we pretty much, on average, have an idea of who we are. It will then, from there, enter the phase of expressing ourselves to greater and greater degree. With some, it may happen by the age of 20. Apparently, Jim Morrison wrote all his poetry by the age of 17 and 19. And all this output of the Doors is recycling of that poetry. He never wrote anything else when he was already a lead singer of that band. I'm just giving you that example. And yet the maturity of his lyrics are mind-boggling. It can only be comparable to the poets of the past who have composed similar kind of complex, rich with metaphor and psychologically charged use of language of a much more older adults, right? So I'm just giving these examples. Some people may never reach that maturity and when they go into their mid-30s and further, and we know and we speak about this as psychologically immature people. It could be due to stresses. It could be due to most likely presence of certain unprocessed traumas. It could be due to the inheritance, DNA. But yogically speaking, one way or the other, it's all linked to the ahamkara, functioning of that principle. So ahamkara is not to be discarded. This is, by the way, where Robert Svoboda very clearly made that in his notorious trilogy, the Agora trilogy, when he wrote about his time with his teacher, Agori Vimalananda, right? This trilogy, which has been, by the way, I think reprinted this year. And he spoke there for the very first time, to my knowledge, in the spiritual community, that it's undesirable to discard one's ahamkara prematurely, or to even create assaults on one's ahamkara when the ahamkara is not ready, because it could bear undesirable consequences. We can end up with undesirable consequences of a weakened ahamkara. Now, when we speak of these great beings, these luminaries, their ahamkara, if you will, melts willingly in the expansive states of consciousness, and very often, perhaps in some cases, at the expense of the fact that they become the recipients of all this, what in the collective consciousness is being absorbed into their expanded ahamkara, which then manifests on a physical level as a particular disease, alignment, including the deadly ones. This is just my take on this. And there are studies and books written about it some times ago. I think late Wayne Dyer, delved into that. He wanted to understand also this phenomena. How come, these amazing beings who often act as healing agents wherever they go, and people certainly receive healing vibes from them, themselves suffer from alignments. So this could be the reason, due to the differences in functioning of the aforementioned ahamkara. So, and of course, there is this also kind of spoken more in a pedestrian way, that all these great luminaries simply absorb collective karma. They absorb that collective karma, and therefore they suffer on the account of this being something being processed through their system, because it cannot be processed elsewhere, so it has to be processed. But it may not be satisfying enough for some, and if you want to understand the underlying reasons for this, then ahamkara is what sheds the light on how all this sits together. Because, and this is, by the way, also there is another aspect to this question, right? Is confusion, which New Age is unfortunately done a lot of also, I don't want to say damage, but it caused some misperception, misconception. And not just New Age, maybe certain spiritual movements also add to that, that somehow spiritual evolution, spiritual evolvement always on par with physical health and well-being and all that, vitality. The truth to that, to the degree, but it's not always true. And this is where it needs to be understood. We will speak about it in greater detail in the part 3, especially in terms of how Kundalini process can manifest itself, and how there are phases in Kundalini which are like honeymoon phases, and one beams with this light, beams with this energy, almost becomes like, amber-like, like sort of has that pranic energy to to this individual. And yet when the process more or less moves to the more mature phases, that somehow wanes, and not necessarily everyone shines with that light. Not every process and not every awakening proceeds in that direction, in that dimension. So we will speak to that, because we don't know what is there in terms of the karmic setup that awaits us, and every awakening steers and brings this to the surface, brings latent tendencies as well as latent samskaras, and samskaras is what makes this karma. It's inseparable. So it's not always all just roses. So this is why this awakening needs to be understood also, and one needs to be equipped with that required courage, understanding, determination, and acceptance to go through it without thinking and without pathologizing the process, which also needs to be given a proper attention, because what is considered pathology today is only in terms of what we understand the pathology today in the age where we have lost the connection to the divine essence. This is also a big, big topic. It's also right next to that question. When the fruit is ripe, is it truly possible to force one's ripening? Okay, it's a good. Okay, when the fruit is ripe, right? When the fruit is ripe, we eat it, and if it's a good fruit, it's juicy, it's tasty, it's delicious. But there are ways to ripen the fruit. If you got avocados and they're still hard, the best way to speed up ripening is to put them into a paper bag so that there's no light, and put them away somewhere. And you'll see that that avocado will ripen 3 times faster than if you left it on a plate. Same goes for other fruits, like banana will ripen faster if it's green completely. And if you put it next to other fruits, especially next to a juicy, oozing with fragrance mango, if you put that green, right, largely astringent banana next to a juicy, ripe mango, then this banana will ripen faster. And on top of that, it will absorb the juiciness and sweetness of the mango, because banana absorbs it, fruit that absorbs the fragrance of other fruits. See? I don't know if that example gives you any further hints, but is it possible to force one's ripening? Force not, but one can assist it. One can trick it. Not that the trick of philosophy carries its name because it tricks something, but hey, there is a bit of that there too, you see? So if, as far as one of these tenets of Shaivism, Monistic Shaivism, that this jiva, this individuality, this separate identity, this separate, if you will, sense, is nothing other than Shiva in disguise, who self-imposed by its own trickstery, that through the force of his Shaktis upon himself, then certainly that same degree of trickstery can be used for regaining that state of Shivahood. So I'll leave you with that to ponder. Just to clarify this, there's a question. So Kundalini awakening precedes student-teacher relationship in order for the inner initiation to be realized. Well, it's not precedes as a prerequisite, because in classically spoken, of course, setting, this how it will be fostered, this how it will be, if you will, arranged. The teacher-student relationship will lead to the transmission of grace, will lead to Shakti path, will lead to some formal initiation, which either manifests there and then or manifests in time, and then it will begin to bear fruit. But it doesn't exclusively mean that this is has to happen in a preceding order, because these are the pillars, indispensable aspects. So very often Kundalini awakens in someone who is clueless about it, without even tradition, without understanding, without even clinical understanding, let alone traditional understanding. So in these people, they then go and look for the preceptor, for the guidance. So you see, so then how in that case can that function? So therefore, we cannot just say that this is a prerequisite. So this is just to clarify. Questions with regard to the chakras, we'll just leave that out now, because it's more specific, maybe belongs to when we talk about the process itself, the process of the ascent and how it can manifest. I can see this question about the healing, because I'm reading it in reverse order. I'm kind of like reading it in non-linear fashion, not in sequence of how questions were posed. But the one, I think it's from the same person. I could be mistaken, but it speaks to this. Could you please shine some light? Sadhguru said if he finds out his disciples do healing to others, he will make sure the spiritual journey is over for them. Why would a guru prevent healing? I'm not sure about the categorical stance, and how can Sadhguru make sure that the spiritual journey is over for them. That I also don't quite get. I hope it's in the language somehow here, and I trust this. It's not something Sadhguru has ever said, because that's not in the hands of Sadhguru, right? This is in no one's hands other than the hands of Shiva himself. So, and then it's absolutely irrelevant to speak about how one can initiate, of course, someone on a path, and this is what our job is. And then things can go astray, but it's not for them to terminate. One can maybe there is this lesser known aspects of working with energy, of course, and attention is energy. Attention is, whenever we put our attention on something, it is accompanied by the force, by energy, by that prana, by that Shakti. So that, and well, the reasons for this, right? Perhaps, I don't know exactly in the case of the aforementioned teacher here, but it's because, and maybe this is spoken in terms of his own community, so that people don't just start becoming free agents there, because healing processes, when someone is in the sadhana, and if one begins to get involved in healing, it has to be done in a fully conscious way. Because A, this would be and often is at the expense of one's own pranic field, of one's own energy field. And B, very often it can be in terms of messing up with someone else's field if one is not trained fully into a certain healing modality. And I will suspect also because of the purification processes that most sadhana is accompanied by, because purificatory phase can throw out certain illnesses, certain diseases. And if someone just steps in the form of the healer, begin to assist this process, there is a possibility of a certain bypassing to take place. Bypassing, learning, and maybe even interfering in what already naturally unfolds there. Other than that, I don't believe that there is someone is preventing someone to heal another person, because I can't believe that can be true. And also, how do we know the difference between a guru who has the knowledge and awareness of the ultimate consciousness and someone who lives as one? Well, in the way the question is constructed, actually, it makes no difference. Awareness of ultimate consciousness and living as one, it almost can be spoken in completely analogous way. It can be spoken in intermediate ways, in interchangeable ways. It can be spoken as synonymous. But I understand what this question means. How to distinguish between someone who knows it all, who knows how it is, and capable of speaking about it very convincingly, and to tell someone who embodies and lives that. Well, I will say that there is none of the criterias out there other than your own intuition. And your intuition has to be really fostered enough to have this access to distinguish. So in other words, there's very little one can have to distinguish this by going by certain aspects of certain, let's say, outward signs or certain accompanying, let's say, whatever that may be. There's no attributes that come with the self-realization. These attributes may be simply tapped into when you are in the presence of that being, even if it's remote presence, which will bring one a certain something. But that, we could say, could come from a person who not necessarily abides and has realized it to the degree where it's one's essence, one's lived reality. So again, you see, some people by nature, by temperament, are more exalted, more, if you will, well, charismatic is another term, but I'm more speaking about these qualities that makes these people attractive. It could just be down to the planetary setup. You put the planets, you have the planets in the right place at birth, and it will make an extremely attractive individual. So this is not still the criteria. So what are the criteria? These criteria simply don't exist. So in other words, it's just left to that what is left to your own force to distinguish, to your own intuition. But I want to add something else to this, is that this is not to undermine the way teachers are. The richness, for example, of how this whole academy of different teachers spoken of, in India at least, is spoken in terms of very different terms. The term teacher has many different other definitions. So that One is that who simply knows the subject and can talk to you about this subject, teach you the subject. Another is that it can teach you some skills. It can introduce you to methodologies and techniques. Another is that can take you beyond the concepts and kind of almost give you the sense as if you're already understanding and holding it and having it as your own. And yet another, it can have this a visceral, energetic experience of the reality, you see? So therefore, we don't want to also just to discard and paint it all, like we don't want to make it black or white, that this teacher can only teach you this, therefore he's incapable. He's capable of delivering and doing what he's good at. And those who go to this teacher sooner or later will realize if they want more, that this teacher cannot give them. So they will progress in their journey. They will hopefully live in peace and gratitude, in bows, and they will continue their journey. This is not at all uncommon, and therefore worthy of a reminder. So that there is understanding how this role is being played. Okay, folks, I guess it's time to wrap it up. We went over time, but I can see there's a lot more questions. So live chat will remain there when this is, well, anyway, so we will continue next Saturday. Thank you all for this time spent together in this gathering. Wishing you all love and light. Jai Gurudev.